Good evening. Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for the History of Systematic Land Theft program in celebration of Native American Heritage Month. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I am an Adult Services Specialist at Gwinnett County Public Library. Tonight, we are joined by moderator Barbara Bernier in conversation with author and attorney Jillian Haishaw, author of the book Systematic Land Theft: The History of U.S. Tactics Keeping Tribal Nations from Reclaiming Their Land and Blacks Landless. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers for tonight. Barbara Bernier was born and raised in Harlem and is a product of New York State University system, studying anthropology and social science. Her degree programs were foundational to a lifelong interest in education, social science, and law. She earned a JD from Howard University School of Law and then on to Temple University for an LLM in legal education. Barbara's parents immigrated from Haiti to start their American lives in New York. Their Sunday dinners grew to include many people from a mix of languages and cultures. She grew up believing there were no differences among people, and the only things distinguishing one person from the next was the perseverance and determination attributed to so many first-generation Americans. Barbara's personal and professional philosophies are grounded in some of her earliest life experiences around her family table. Jillian Haishaw is a MacArthur awardee, agricultural attorney, founder and director of Farms, an international nonprofit, and Haishaw Law LLC, a virtual law practice. Inspired by her own family's land loss, Farms provides technical and legal assistance to small farmers while reducing hunger in the farmers' community. Haishaw has over 20 years of professional experience in the areas of civil rights, land protection, and agricultural policy. Her prior experience includes working on land protection matters for local and state agencies and on civil rights matters for the US. Haishaw's recent advocacy work for Black farmers in the hemp and cannabis space has led to publish op-ed articles in Civil Eats, The Counter, and Hempland USA. Haishaw has a bachelor's degree in biology from Tuskegee University, plus a Juris Doctor in legal master's in agricultural law from the University of Arkansas Fayetteville Law School. Haishaw's own land loss experience has influenced her commitment to law and advocacy work in agriculture and asset protection. Please welcome Jillian Haishaw and Barbara Bernier.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, Miriam, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank all of you for being here with us this evening. And I'd also like to thank the Gwinnett County Library for hosting this event. So just a few housekeeping notes before we jump into this discussion. Jillian Haishaw's material is copyright protected, and a portion of all book sales will be donated to Farms, her nonprofit that aids farmers both domestically and internationally. And if you'd like more information about her work and to purchase her books, please visit www.jillianhaishaw.com for more information. Welcome. Good to see you.
You too.
Glad you're here. Glad you're here. It's been a real banner year for you this year. You've won five awards this year for your book, Systematic Land Theft, which has been, I would imagine, it is quite an honor to get all of these kinds of awards. So you were awarded the Next Generation Indie Book Award for 2022, the Independent Press Award, the National Indie Excellence Award, the New York City Big Book Award, and the most recent, the Best Fest Award for that book, Systematic Land Theft. Congratulations, what an honor to be interviewing you and to have read the book. I have personal experience reading the book and just knowing that a lot of other people recognize what you have contributed to this body of work and to this topic. So let's just get into some general questions I'd like to ask you, and then we'll delve into the more specific questions about the book. And I guess the first thing I'd like to ask you is, how did you come to write the book? How long did it take you to write it? What was your impetus for getting into this area of law?
Yes, and thank you again for facilitating and having me, the Gwinnett County Library. So it started as a white paper when I was working for a state conservation department. And that was back in 2007. So the first 3 chapters were written between '07 and '09. And then in '09, I created a course at the University of Missouri, Kansas City as an adjunct professor and taught those 3 chapters. And then gradually I finished up the book in 2021 last year. So total 14 years.
Wow, that's amazing. And from reading the book, I gathered that the amount of research that you put into it probably did take you a long time to kind of navigate what it is that you wanted to hone in on, because it's so much historical information in this book. And I'll get into some more of the specifics. Is this book part of a group of books? Is this something, I know you've published some other material. Would you like to share with us how this book fits into the bigger picture?
Sure. So it's basically a collection of books. So it's not just the land theft book, but my first book that I published in 18 was Don't Bet the Farm on Medicaid. And that focuses on basically highlighting state exemptions that can protect people's home and land from a Medicaid lien, because people don't realize that when they qualify for Medicaid, if they owe an outstanding debt to the nursing home or even a rehab facility, the nursing home has not only the state, but the federal authority to put a lien on your land or even your car. And so there are certain things that you can do prior to applying for Medicaid to protect your assets. And then I'm coming out with a few other books here in the next few months that deal with decreasing people's tax liability if they own farmland or just land in general, as well as to complement the land theft book, looking at all 50 state flags and their historical symbolism to slavery.
Wow. Wow, that's a lot of work. So this is a continuation of your work. You mentioned Medicaid, the Medicaid book, and I'd like to just touch on that for a minute, because Medicaid affects everybody, right? I mean, as people get older, we're not just talking about farmers here, but we're talking about the general population. As people get older, sometimes they do have to go into a nursing home. And what happens to their property if they own a property?
Of course. So if traditionally the way Medicaid is written is for low income residents of a state. And if you own assets, a house, land, a car even, then they can basically penalize you in the beginning. And so if all of those assets are in your name, then you are disqualified for Medicaid and you're penalized. And so, for example, if you apply back in 2020, but you transferred the deed of your land or house back in 2017, well, there's a 5-year penalty and a look back period. And so you would be penalized for 2 years because, the 2020 and 17, that's 3 years. And then you would, of course, won't qualify for Medicaid for another 2 years. And so putting your assets under a LLC or just transferring them to someone that you trust is very important to do prior to applying for Medicaid, because if you don't, then they can take your land and your property to cover the debt.
Wow. So this sounds like something everybody who's out there who's listening to us and watching this webinar probably needs to get that book to learn more about. You don't want it to happen when you get to the end. You want it to happen. You want to learn and know about it before you have to, deal with those kinds of
and that
issues.
book is in its 5th edition. I just updated the book. So each year Medicaid comes out with updated income limits and things like this. And so it's updated each year, and each year I add different states. And so this year I added New York, Texas, and Pennsylvania. Okay. But out of all of the 25 states that are covered in the book so far, Florida has the best exemptions. You can exempt up to 160 acres plus the homestead.
Wow, great. Well, I think that's something that a lot of people who are listening to us will probably want to get that book to learn what the specifics are for their particular states. So I'd like to turn a little bit now to what has happened. What was your impetus in writing the systematic land theft books, and that's the book that we're going to discuss at length tonight. And do you view writing as a spiritual practice? What I mean is, you mentioned your great grandmother, Hattie, who was a woman landowner in the early 1900s. What impact did she have upon you to get you to go down this road of researching this book?
Yes, well, it was sort of accidental because I just knew kind of the generalities of our land loss story as I began to write the book. And I knew that my grandfather was raised on a farm in Muskogee, Oklahoma, and that they lost the land, but I didn't know a lot of the details surrounding the loss of the land until it was revealed through elders in my family that my great great grandmother hired a lawyer to pay the property tax on the land. And unfortunately, the lawyer stole the money and the land was sold in a tax lien sale. And so because of that, it definitely propelled even more interest for me to just dig deeper and to really basically document and outline the historic facts of not just my family, but just in general of Black folks losing land, particularly, at the turn of the century and up until the present.
Wow. So could you also connect the issue of the Choctaw, as you mentioned in your book, and the five civilized tribes, and the idea of matrilineal societies? Because I think in reading about that information, but also your grandmother, your great grandmother owning land, right? She owned land, and that was something that was really unheard of back in those days for women to have ownership interest in property. Could you give us a little bit of the background to that issue?
Yes, it was very unique. So Oklahoma is a very unique state. In the early 1900s, Black people owned about 1.5 million collectively, and that was the highest amount of Black ownership out of all of the 50 states during that time.
Are you
And
saying 1.5 million acres?
yes, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, great.
1.5
That's
million,
good.
yes, 1.5 million acres. And one of those individuals, of course, was my great grandmother amongst her 6 other siblings. And so my great great grandmother, Julia, she was owned by the Cree Nation. And during the settlement period and all these types of things, post Reconstruction, the federal government gave freedmen as well as tribal nations that were forced to relocate from the Southeast acreage. And each person was allotted 160 acres. Now, up until a month or two ago, I thought it was always 40 acres, but it was in actuality 160 acres that she owned, which was very unique for a woman to own in the early 1900s. And so this was actually not uncommon among certain tribes, the Chickasaw tribe. And so with the Chickasaw tribal nation, they are a matriarchal nation, which basically all of the lineage is based on the mother, not the father. Now, comparatively, in English common law with Europeans, everything is a patriarchal society based on the lineage of the father. And so traditionally, when a woman in particular was married, once they married, all of their property was automatically transferred to their husband. But, Fisher v. Allen was a case that created precedence, and it was started by the Chickasaw Nation in Mississippi in the early 1800s. And it was created based on the fact that I believe it was Miss Fisher owned Tony, which was an enslaved African, and her husband owed a debt, and the court wanted to seize all of the property collectively that they both owned. But she contested it, and it went all the way up to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals sided with Miss Fisher, stating that African was separate property. And because, of course, back then, enslaved Africans were considered property, she created the precedence for separate property for women, which,
Wow. So that's I'm sure that's something that certainly a lot of people didn't know, that this matrilineal relationship in terms of ownership of land. And how did your great grandmother wind up owning the land?
Well, if you were a freedman, meaning if you were a former enslaved African of the five civilized tribes that primarily occupied Indian territory, which is now known as the state of Oklahoma, then the federal government allotted land to both tribal nation members and formerly enslaved people. And so that's how she received the land along with her six children, because she was enslaved by the Cree Nation.
So you're saying then that Native Americans had enslaved Africans living with them on native land. Is that what you're getting at?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. Tribal groups owned slaves, enslaved
Okay.
Africans.
Could you talk a little bit, because there's an issue with the indigenous, how the relationship between indigenous people, Native Americans, and Black people known as Africans at that African slaves at that particular point. What was their relationship before the Louisiana Purchase, and then after the Louisiana Purchase?
Yeah, so before the Louisiana Purchase, what took place in the early 1820s, they still owned enslaved Africans, but they just owned them on their own plantations in the Southeast. And so when I refer to the five civilized tribes, I'm talking about the Chickasaw Nation, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Seminole, as well as the Cree that owned my great-great-grandmother. And in doing so, historically, until I believe the late 1700s, was documented that all of these five nations owned enslaved Africans in the Southeast. Particularly you can look at, for example, Robert Love, and he had a large plantation, I believe, in the Carolinas. And I believe he was either Choctaw or Chickasaw. And so even prior to relocating to Oklahoma during the Removal Act of 1830, they still owned enslaved Africans. However, it was very unique with the Seminole Nation, because the Seminole Nation they coexisted with enslaved Africans, and they were actually comrades, and they lived on the same land and ate the same food and fellowshipped together. And before the land was ceded from Spain into the U.S. in 1821, they fought 4 wars together against whites across the border, and particularly in Georgia, against enslavement, because before 1821, Spain owned Florida, and they stopped and they ceased enslavement of Africans in, I believe it was 1693. So between 1693 and 1821, Florida was considered a, quote, free state. And a lot of runaway slaves in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama would run, away to Florida for freedom. And that's why a lot of the, quote, Black towns were created, like Rosewood, Florida. And, there's a movie about that. And so because of that, a lot of the runaway slaves would join comrades with the Seminole Nation and fight against Europeans regarding slavery.
Wow. And so that was primarily in the Florida, what we know now is the Florida area. Before, when it was the Louisiana Purchase, was just one big plot of land. Now we're talking about what the states look like, right? So there's a relationship then, I guess, a unique relationship between the Black people and the Seminoles, right? From what you're saying, were there other relationships in Georgia or Louisiana or Oklahoma even between that were similar to what was going on in Florida, where they were comrades between Black people and Native Americans?
Yes, so I outlined the difference between the slave owning tribes, which I particularly focus on the 5 civilized tribes in chapter 4, comparatively to the abolitionist tribes in chapter 5. And so there were definitely tribal nations that fought against slavery, particularly in the Civil War and, after and before. And, some of those include the Sioux Nation, also the Comanche, and Shawnee, just various tribes that I mentioned in chapter 4. And so there was definitely camaraderie there, because once Europeans started to settle in the United States, they all were indentured, considered in the indentured servitude, and then eventually that morphed into slavery. And so they were all forced to labor on, plantations, and basically cultivate the land that we see today. But eventually the federal government separated the two groups, and tribes were confined to reserved land. And then enslaved Africans, of course, were the number one labor on the plantation.
You mentioned a minute ago about the Trail of Tears. Could you tell us about the relationship between Native people and Black people as it relates to this Trail of Tears? Maybe some people may not know what the Trail of Tears was. Could you give us a little bit, enlighten us about that?
Of course. So during the Removal Act of 1830, tribes were forced to sell their land under treaty agreements with the federal government. But of course, this land was sold way below the market value even during that time, which led to, hundreds of years later, court cases and settlements up till today. But during the Trail of Tears, the tribal groups that were forced off of their land under these erroneous treaty agreements were forced to relocate to the plain states like the Dakotas, even Arkansas, Missouri, Kansas, and of course, Indian Territory, which again is known as Oklahoma. And so I focus on chapter 4 of, again, the 5 civilized tribes being forced to relocate to Indian Territory via Oklahoma along the Trail of Tears. And thousands of people, particularly tribal members, were lost, during that trail, because they had to walk it from, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, even. And along that, people don't realize that they also dragged enslaved Africans that they owned as property along that Trail of Tears as well.
Wow. The Removal Act, you mentioned the Removal Act. What was that about?
So again, it was the forced sale of tribal land to the federal government under treaty agreements. And these treaty agreements paid the tribal nations a certain amount of money, but it was well below market amount. And then they allocated land in the plain states for each individual tribal nation to relocate to, because they wanted all of the land in the southeast particularly for the expansion of slave plantations and whatnot.
And so this Removal Act is really part and parcel, from what you're saying, with the trail, right? The trail was what happened with those people as they moved from the East Coast into the prairie states, I guess, or the middle of the country, like you said, North Dakota and
Yes,
South
and
Dakota.
that removal period it started in the early 1830s, and it lasted through the 1870s.
Were there ever reparations? I mean, we hear that a lot in terms of, reparations for slavery, but were there ever reparations to Native people from the United States government?
Yes, yes. And they were settled out in court often. And so eventually the tribal nation sued in federal court, and a settlement was reached with many, many tribal nations. And they're still reaching these settlements up until today. And so I do go into detail about some of the settlements in chapter 4 through 7.
Great. So I'd like to turn your attention a little bit to, you just mentioned some specifics in terms of chapter 4. And in chapter 4, you discuss the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma. Can you expand the discussion that you've been talking about with your connection to Oklahoma and why you devote this chapter to the 5 tribes?
Yes, so I definitely devoted to the 5 tribes because of my family's lineage in Oklahoma. And there's 12 chapters in the book. Each chapter has a case study, but chapter 4, my family's story is the case study. And I focus in particular on all 5 tribes, which again include the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and of course the Cree that owned my great great grandmother Julia. And Oklahoma is very unique. It was designated as, quote, Indian territory, and it included not only the full state of Oklahoma, but also southern portions of Kansas, also western portions of Missouri, and certain sections of Arkansas. And they were all allocated sections of these different states to live on. And so in particular, the Seminole Nation was one of the final nations to leave Florida to relocate in this area. And when they left Florida and settled in Oklahoma, they had to settle on land that was allocated to the Cree Nation. Now, the Cree Nation historically adopted these slave plantation tactics. And a lot of these nations adopted these brutal slave plantation tactics because in the late 1700s, when Europeans settled, they allowed European men to marry into the tribe and to marry tribal women. And because of this, they adopted a lot of the European tactics regarding slavery. Now, traditionally they would capture other members from a different tribe and, have them do laborious, labor, things, but it wasn't the brutality of, plantation and slavery and things like this. And so with the mixing of Europeans and tribal groups, they just started adopting, these different types of ways of life.
Did they change the matrilineal discussion, that the point that you raised earlier about the matrilineal arrangement? Was that changed? Did that change when Europeans intermarried with Native Americans?
I don't believe so, not initially, because even with the Fisher case that came down in the Court of Appeals in Mississippi, I believe in the 1820s. And so they started marrying into the tribes in the late 1700s. And so as far as I know, up until that point, it didn't change. But I didn't research, after that, after Fisher v. Allen.
Because it seems like the whole concept of matrilineal power, if you will, that descends from a woman to her children, is still very much, and I'm not an expert certainly in Native American issues, but is it, I don't know, is it, does that still hold today, that children inherit or children take through their mothers?
I believe so, but I'm not for certain. But I know that in particular with the Chickasaw and the Choctaw Nation, they were definitely a matriarchal society. And so the husband could have as many wives as he wished, but once he died, it was separate property. And so the woman would take ownership of her property and her children, and then the heirs of the husband would basically strip the wife and the mother of the children of anything, and take his property, separate and back into their family.
Wow.
And so it's definitely interesting researching.
Yeah. In chapter 8, speaking of inheritance and land loss, in chapter 8, you discuss Blacks and intergenerational land loss. Can you give us your thought process in selecting that topic?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it just coincides with my work. And so I've been working with Black farmers for about 15, 20 years. And just hearing their land loss stories and their challenges has led to, present litigation against USDA that I have pending right now in federal court for the past year and a half. And so when it comes to Black land loss, particularly in the Black community, we lose 30,000 acres in land ownership per year. And that's primarily due to lack of estate planning and also predatory lending tactics, particularly by USDA. Because USDA was established a year before emancipation, proclamation with the Civil war and everything. And even a year before, when Black folk were enslaved, they required that that enslaved Africans, now freedmen, have a collateral, that they put up collateral if they wanted any type of farm loan. And, that bodes well, present with the current cases that I'm tackling at the moment.
Well, so does the USDA treat Black farmers as the same as they do indigenous people or Native Americans?
Well, both groups are definitely disenfranchised. I mean, 97, 98% of all farmland is owned by whites in this country. So collectively, people of color, own about, 3 to 4%, if that. And so there is disfranchisement there. There was a recent comparison in a report that stated that Native Americans or indigenous or tribal groups, their rate of acceptance of a farm loan application is equivalent to whites compared to Blacks. And so there is a bit of a shining light there that tribal groups and members do have an approval rate that is equivalent to whites. But unfortunately, with Blacks, it's quite, stark contrast. The approval rating is, 80% even. And then ironically, we own the least amount of land next to Asian Americans, but we are the highest out of all demographics when it comes to the foreclosure rate. And so between 2006 and 2016, Blacks were foreclosed on by USDA at a 13% rate compared to all other demographics.
So 13% of the whole, right? So how many? So does that mean that it relates to whites or other groups who have farmland, they didn't foreclose upon them as often?
Correct. So out of all of the groups, white, indigenous, Asian, Hispanic, Blacks had the highest foreclosure rate at 13%.
Do you think that the USDA going forward, since there's been a new law that allows, I think Biden tried to pass a law last year, or did pass a law last year, that would somehow, rectify this problem with Black farmers? How do you think that's what's going to happen in the future with that kind of law? Will Black farmers be able to, receive just compensation for their efforts?
Well, unfortunately, over 90% of the land that we owned in the early 1900s has been lost. And a lot of that is due in part to the predatory lending practices of USDA in particular. And so, we owned upwards to 16 to 20 millions in the early 1900s. And now we own, they say about 4.5 million, but I believe it's way less. I believe it's about 3 million that we own collectively, because USDA does inflate the numbers by including, urban gardeners in that number. And that's not truly a rural farmer. And so because of that, the numbers with the 2017 USDA census is definitely skewed. But moving forward with first, March 11, 2021, the American Rescue Plan was passed, and it included debt relief specifically for socially disadvantaged farmers, which are farmers of color, which primarily included Black and Hispanic and indigenous farmers. But 13 suits were passed in the spring and in the summer by white farmers in federal court, and an injunction was held in that summer in July last year to stop debt relief to go specifically to farmers of color. And so because of that, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed the last week of August basically included, quote, distressed farmers, which include white farmers. And so within the past 2 weeks, USDA has spent over, or just about, last I checked, half of that money, because $3 billion was allocated to debt relief. And they've spent about 1.4, last I checked, to basically relieve past farm debt for 36,000 farmers. Now, of course, the majority of those farmers are white. And so, many of the farmers that I work with, stay in contact with, have not received debt relief. I can count on like 2 or 3 fingers how many have received relief. And if they did receive relief, it's only partial, it's not full. And, according to the provisions, Section 22006, all principal and interest should be eliminated, and of course, Black farmers, that, did receive any type of relief, all of that was not relieved, only a portion.
Wow. You mentioned a little earlier, and I just wanted to jump back to that about heirs and heirs property. Could you tell the audience a little bit about what that is and what does that do to people, to land as it descends from one generation to the other? I think this connects to our intergenerational land loss discussion.
Yes, and so the federal government was very purposeful in different tactics, again, to basically deprive not only, of course, tribal groups of their land, which is all of their land here, but also Black folk that own land in the early 1900s. And a lot of that, unfortunately, is due to lack of estate planning, because most landowners that are of color, they don't have the means to afford legal counsel. And so usually when you pass away with land ownership or even a house, if it's owned by a married couple, say the husband dies first and then the wife dies, then if they die without a will, then it's left to their heirs, which is usually their children. And then after certain generation after generation of people passing away without a will, about, I don't know, 90 people own a house in New Orleans, which happened in Katrina, or 90 people own 100, acre tract of land in Ruby, South Carolina. And when one of those heirs sells to a third party, which oftentimes is a developer, that developer basically becomes part of the family, and they can force the sale, in which is called a partition sale. And that's how we lose, the 30,000 acres per year in land ownership. And that's how a lot of land, even reserved land by tribal groups, were lost, because the federal government went back and created a it's connected to the Dawes Act. I can't remember at the moment, but in the early 1900s, which basically propelled the fractionization of, the land that they owned. And so various laws have been passed and provisions have been passed to curtail, heirs property loss among tribal groups over the past 10 years. And also a uniform Partition of Heirs Properties Act has been passed in about 25 out of the 50 states to curtail the land loss among Black Americans as well.
So this goes back to what you initially started talking about, which was the whole Medicaid issue, right? All this stuff is so connected because it's the same issue. If you don't put your property in the right place and protect it, the government, you can lose it. And like you said, somebody who's not even related to you, which is astonishing, somebody who's not even related to you can come in and buy a share or buy a part of the land, and then force everybody else who has an ownership interest to sell. And what is that called again?
Well, the legal term is tenants in common, but most owners know it as heirs property.
Okay, so this is again another issue in terms of people really understanding. We've been talking about land ownership as it relates to farmers, but this is also something that goes across the board to any land ownership, which is what you mentioned earlier with Medicaid, with that Medicaid issue. And now you're mentioning, in addition to the Medicaid issue, you're also saying not only to protect yourself, but to also have a will, right? And so, go ahead.
Yes, 68% of Black Americans die without a will in this country, and I believe 73 to 74% of Hispanics die without a will, in the last report that I had checked on. And so it's very important that people have a will drafted. And there are a few states left where a handwritten will, is a valid legal document. And so like in Minnesota, for example, you can write a handwritten will. And so it's very important to write out, your assets, because, these things happen, particularly, for example, in Katrina, a lot of houses in the Ninth Ward were owned heirs property, 30 people owning a house, and FEMA was going to give them money, but they couldn't give them money because you need to have a clear deed in order to give money, in order to qualify for a home
Could you
loan.
explain to the audience what a clear deed means?
So basically, a clear deed is when the deed of property, whether it's a house or land, is owned by a single person or a married couple. And if it's not owned by a single person or a married couple, it needs to be in a trust, an irrevocable trust, or a limited liability corporation.
Okay, so just to clarify a little bit, so because it seems like what you're saying, the reason you got 90 people in Katrina who owned one piece of land is because nobody ever probated there was no will to probate, right? And
Right.
so it just keeps growing and growing and growing, and then eventually a developer finds out and they jump into it, and that's how these people wind up losing or
Correct.
forced to sell their land. And just to underscore that, when they're forced by the developer, the other people, to sell their land, do they get fair market value?
No, oftentimes when it's sold at a partition sale, it's sold 75% to 80% below market value. And I tackle all of these things in chapter 10, 11, and 12 with,
Systematic
fragmentation.
land theft. Great. So it's we have about 15 minutes left to this hour, and at this point, what we'd like to do is open up the floor to questions and answers. So if you have a question you'd like to ask Attorney Highshaw, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and we will pull up those questions for you. Any question is, there are no crazy questions. Just ask, and you will be answered. Before we begin our Q&A, and while we're waiting for you to send questions, Jillian Highshaw's material is copyright protected, and a portion of all book sales will be donated to Farms, her nonprofit that aids farmers both domestically and internationally. And Ms. Highshaw just mentioned a little earlier a couple of new books that are being published, or just about published, right? And one is called 50 State U.S. Flags and Their Historic Symbolism, right there. And farm tax credits for all 50 US states, in addition to the book that we're talking about tonight, which is called Systematic Land Theft, which is an incredible book in terms of, if you wanted to know the history of land ownership in this country and the connection between Native American people and Black people and the federal government, this is a great book to have. And as I mentioned earlier, she has won 5 book awards for this particular book. Okay, so we've got a few questions that we are going to ask Jillian. The first question is, can the developer be bought by a family instead of them forcing a sale?
Yes, and so the good thing is that if you have a will, you can put in a certain clause, which is called the right of first refusal clause. And the right of first refusal clause requires that if one of the heirs wants to sell their portion, that they have to offer it to, going back to the example, their sister or brother. And so that's also now automatically included in the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. So in 25 states under that act, like in Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, the Carolinas, except for North Carolina, they haven't adopted it, but they have adopted it in Virginia and so forth. That right of first refusal clause is automatically entered in the law now, in the state law. And so the distant cousin that lives in Vancouver or California can't sell their share. They're legally required to offer their share to a family member. And then that family member has about 2 months, 60 days to get it appraised and come up with the money and everything.
Great, thank you. Next question. In general, were relationships between Native Americans and Blacks strained, or were Native Americans welcoming towards enslaved Africans?
It depends on the tribe. So currently, yes, it's definitely challenged, and so often, going back to the five civilized tribes. So in 1979, the Cree Nation, which again owned my great great grandmother Julia, they terminated the tribal rights of enslaved Africans, or which is known as freedmen. And they terminated their rights because they were starting to receive a lot of settlement money for the breach of contracts of these, bad treaty agreements that they were forced to sell their land under, 90 or 100 years prior to. And so in 1979, since up until the present day, the Cree Nation of Oklahoma specifically terminated the tribal rights, and they gave all of their formerly enslaved Africans tribal rights under the 1866 treaty right after the Emancipation Proclamation. However, most of these tribes have tried to terminate their rights. And so in 2000, for example, I believe the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma terminated the rights of the Black freedmen in 2000, and they're still terminated. Also, the Cherokee Nation terminated rights in the early 2000s, but Miss Marilyn Vaughn, a Black woman that sued the Cherokee Nation and won, just got the Black freedmen's rights reinstated, amongst other claimants in that suit, but just got those rights reinstated within the past 5 to 10 years. And so she's just a pioneer. And I also had the privilege to interview her for my book. And that interview is included in chapter 4 as well.
Great, thank you. I think the next question you probably answered, but I'm just going to state it and then we can see whether or not it was completely answered. This question was probably already answered, but how do the reparations for Native Americans directly affect the descendants of enslaved Africans that were owned by the Native Americans? Do they get a portion of the land, which I think is what you just mentioned about Ms. Vaughn a little bit?
Yes, and so when it comes to land, again, they were allocated 160 acres, in the early 1900s when my family received the land along with members of the tribal group. And you had to be listed on the Dawes rolls. And so there was two types of rolls. There was the blood Dawes rolls, which was allocated for blood quantum for people that were of full-blooded or partial blood. For example, in order to be listed on the blood Dawes rolls, you had to be at least 25% blood in the Seminole Nation. And you had to prove lineage with, an ancestor's name. But with the Dawes rolls for the freedmen, you had to show that or prove that you were owned or whatever by one of those tribal nations. And so they were allocated 160 acres, but then the money started coming in with the settlement in the 50s and the 60s. And during the 50s and the 60s, the Black freedmen were given a portion of that settlement. However, all of the 5 tribes, in particular, the 5 civilized tribes, have terminated the freedmen's rights. Now, again, the Cherokee just reinstated due to, under court duress, but, the remaining 4 have since, terminated all of the freedmen's rights. And so the Black freedmen have not received any money from those settlements.
Right. Okay, next question. I'm curious how or if one-parent homes are affected differently than others. I'm not quite sure what this was. I said you mentioned this vaguely in chapter 9, but I may have missed the connection.
I
don't know. The one-parent home, I don't know what that. If that person could just, send a little update on that so we can clarify what it is that you're looking for, that'd be great. And then the next one is, our family has air property land in Mississippi. What do you think is the first thing my family should do to protect our land?
Well, it depends on the status of how the land is owned. So if it's, again, owned as heirs property, which the majority of of Black-owned land is, about 70% to be more specific, then you definitely need to clear the title and the deed. And so what that would entail is hiring a licensed attorney in Mississippi, and then getting all of the heirs to agree to clear title. And that title process would include getting all of the heirs to agree, and then running a ad in the local newspaper for a few weeks to give notice to all of the unknown heirs. And then once that happens, you would go through the quiet title action, and then it would be cleared. The deed would be cleared, but it needs to be cleared in a certain person's name, or a limited liability corporation, or better yet, a irrevocable trust.
Okay, I think that is, oh, wait, hold on. We have one more question and we're almost out of time. It's almost 5 minutes up. What's the best way to encourage more people of color who own property to have a will made?
Well, for my nonprofit has been in operation for about 10 years, coming up on our 9th year here this month. And we have offered estate planning services for a low cost, and we're slowly going away from that because our coffers are a little bit limited. But definitely seek out assistance from a law school. A lot of law schools have legal clinics that offer low cost estate planning services, or even no cost pro bono. And also legal aid. Legal aid is a really great place to have a will drafted, or even a credit union. If you're a member of a credit union, you can get a will drafted, at a low cost.
So, Ms. Highshaw, it has been a pleasure to be with you this evening. Thank you very much for an enlightening and interesting discussion. I'd again like to thank the Gwinnett Public Library for sponsoring this evening's discussion, and I'd like to thank you, our audience. I learned quite a bit and hope that all of you have as well. Again, to contact Ms. Highshaw, please visit Jillian Highshaw, HISAW.com. Don't forget to buy the book. Thank you. Good night.